Miss Winters. The young master refuses to speak to anyone. The warning came before Victoria had even removed her gloves. And the little miss? She asked quietly. Mrs. Dawson hesitated. She calls for her mother every night. The words hung in the cold Yorkshire air like a funeral bell. Victoria stepped fully into Warrington Hall, rainwater still clinging to the hem of her dark traveling cloak. Behind her, the carriage rolled away through the iron gates, its wheels fading into the mist. There would be no returning now. She had not come merely to teach children. She had come to disappear. The vast entrance hall swallowed her small figure. Marble floors reflected the flicker of candlelight. Portraits of stern Hargrave ancestors watched from the walls, their painted eyes cold with centuries of judgment. A house of dukes, a house of silence. Mrs. Dawson began walking ahead. The children's wing is at the far end of the second floor, the housekeeper said. His Grace prefers the rest of the house kept quiet. Because of the children? Victoria asked. No, Mrs. Dawson replied softly. Because of grief. They climbed the staircase. Victoria felt the weight of the house pressing in around her. Every polished railing and velvet curtain whispered of a life she had once known too well. London ballrooms, crystal chandeliers, silk gowns, and a brother who had tried to sell her like property. Her fingers tightened around the leather case she carried. Inside were the only remains of the Lady Victoria Lennox. The world now knew only Miss Clara Winters, a modest governess, invisible, safe. At the end of the corridor, Mrs. Dawson stopped before a large oak door. The nursery, she said. Then after a pause, they haven't laughed in 2 years. She opened the door. The room beyond was large, elegant, and unbearably still. Heavy curtains blocked most of the daylight. Toys were arranged with unnatural precision, untouched by the chaos of real childhood. A wooden horse stood stiff beside the hearth. A porcelain doll stared blankly from a velvet chair. Everything looked preserved, like a memory someone was afraid to disturb. And in the center of the room sat the Duke's children, Thomas Hargrave, 7 years old, already too serious for his age. His dark hair and pale blue eyes were unmistakably his father's. Beside him sat his younger sister Sophie, only 5, small hands folded in her lap. Brown curls framed a quiet face that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. They both stared at her, studying, measuring, waiting. Victoria closed the door softly behind her. Then she did something no previous governess had dared. She knelt, not like a servant, but like someone meeting equals. "Hello," she said gently. "My name is Miss Winters." Neither child answered. Thomas watched her with wary composure. But Sophie leaned slightly forward, curious. The last lady left, the little girl whispered. Victoria's heart tightened. Did she? She said we were difficult. The words were spoken with innocent confusion, not accusation. Victoria smiled slowly. Then she wasn't the right lady. Thomas finally spoke. His voice was calm, certain. You'll leave too. Not a question. A fact. Victoria met his gaze. The gaze of a boy who had already learned not to trust promises. No, she said quietly. Not unless you ask me to. Silence settled over the nursery. Then Sophie tilted her head. You talk funny. Victoria blinked. Do I? The little girl nodded. Like Mama. Thomas stiffened. Don't talk about Mama. His voice snapped through the room like breaking glass. Sophie shrank back immediately. Tears filled her eyes. Before they could fall, Victoria gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. It's all right to talk about her, she said softly. The people we love don't disappear when we say their names. Thomas stared at her. Something fragile flickered in his guarded eyes. Sophie's small hand slowly slipped into Victoria's. Warm, trusting, lonely. And in that simple touch, something inside Victoria cracked open. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Dawson returned to check on the lesson. She stopped in the doorway, frozen. Victoria sat cross-legged on the carpet. A book lay open in her lap. Sophie leaned against her shoulder. Thomas pretended to read at his desk, though his eyes kept drifting toward the story. Victoria's voice filled the room softly. And the night crossed the dark forest because courage means going forward even when you are afraid. Mrs. Dawson blinked. The sound in the room was unmistakable. Sophie giggled, a small uncertain laugh. The first that house had heard in 2 years. And somewhere else in Warrington Hall, behind the closed door of a study lit by firelight, Alexander Hargrave, Duke of Warrington, paused mid-sentence as he signed a document, because he heard it too. The laughter of his daughter, a sound he had buried with his wife. Slowly, he set down the pen, and for the first time in 2 years, the Duke stood. Alexander Hargrave had trained himself not to react to ghosts. For 2 years he had lived inside Warrington Hall, as though emotion itself were a dangerous intruder. The house functioned perfectly. Ledgers balanced, estates prospered, servants obeyed, but life had quietly drained from its walls. So when laughter drifted through the upper corridor that afternoon, his first instinct was not hope. It was suspicion. He stepped out of his study slowly. The sound came again, small, bright, unmistakable. Sophie. Alexander felt something inside his chest tighten painfully. That laugh had vanished the day Eleanor died. He had believed it gone forever. Without realizing it, he was already walking upstairs. The corridor leading to the nursery felt longer than usual. Each step echoed beneath his boots, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent house. At the nursery door he stopped. The door was slightly open. Inside he saw her. The new governess, Miss Clara Winters. She sat on the floor beside Sophie, a book open in her lap. The little girl leaned against her shoulder, eyes shining with delight. Thomas sat nearby, trying very hard to look uninterested. And the dragon realized, Miss Winters said gently, that courage is not the absence of fear. Sophie gasped dramatically. What is it then? Choosing kindness, the governess replied, smiling softly. Even when the world has not been kind to you. Thomas frowned thoughtfully. That doesn't sound like a dragon. Miss Winters tilted her head. Perhaps this one was tired of being alone. Sophie giggled again. Alexander felt the sound strike him like a memory. For 2 years he had forbidden himself from entering this room. The children reminded him too strongly of what he had lost. Yet now he stood there watching a stranger bring warmth back into a place he had allowed to grow cold. Then Miss Winters looked up. Their eyes met. She rose immediately and curtsied. Your Grace? Her voice was calm, but he noticed something odd. She curtsied too well. Not the awkward bow of a servant. The smooth, practiced movement of a woman raised among society. Alexander stepped inside. Thomas straightened instantly. Sophie hid half behind the governess's skirts. The Duke ignored the children for a moment. His attention remained on Miss Winters. She stood very still beneath his gaze. Her dress was simple, but the fabric was expensive. Her posture was effortless. Her chin lifted slightly when she met his eyes. Not challenging, but not submissive either. Curious, very curious. The children appear occupied, he said at last. Miss Winters folded her hands neatly. They are eager to learn, Your Grace. Thomas cleared his throat. Miss Winters says stories are easier to remember than rules. Alexander looked at the boy. Do you believe that? Thomas hesitated. Yes. Sophie suddenly ran forward, holding the book. Papa, look. Alexander stiffened slightly. She had not called him that in weeks. Sophie pointed proudly at a word. I read this. He looked down. Courage. His voice softened despite himself. That is very good. Sophie beamed. Then she skipped back to the governess. Alexander turned again to Miss Winters. Your references state you worked in Bath. Yes, Your Grace. With which family? For a moment, just a fraction, she hesitated. The Hartwell family. The name meant nothing. Alexander knew every notable household in Bath. But he said nothing. Instead, he studied her again. There was intelligence in her eyes. And restraint. Secrets. Dangerous things in a woman who worked under his roof. Yet somehow the children looked calmer standing beside her. Alive. Alexander finally stepped back toward the door. Continue your lessons, Miss Winters. She inclined her head politely. Yes, Your Grace. He left without another word. But that evening, standing alone beside the fire in his study, Alexander poured a glass of brandy and stared into the flames. The house sounded different tonight. Less empty. More human. He told himself it meant nothing. A governess doing her duty. Nothing more. Yet the image refused to leave his mind. Miss Winters kneeling beside Sophie. Thomas listening with quiet fascination. The strange grace in her posture. The way she had looked directly at him without fear. Alexander frowned, because one unsettling thought refused to fade. Miss Clara Winters was hiding something. And for the first time in 2 long years, the Duke of Warrington found himself very interested enough to find out what it was. The invitation arrived just before sunset. Mrs. Dawson appeared in the schoolroom doorway with an expression that suggested something had gone terribly wrong. Miss Winters, she said carefully, His Grace requests your presence at dinner this evening. The room fell silent. Victoria slowly lowered the book she had been reading to Sophie. I beg your pardon? The Duke wishes to discuss the children's progress. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Even at 7 he understood what the adults would not say aloud. Governesses did not dine with dukes. Not unless something unusual was happening. Victoria forced a polite smile. Please thank His Grace, I will attend. But when the housekeeper left, Sophie whispered, Are you in trouble? Victoria brushed a curl from the little girl's face. No, darling. Though she was no longer certain. Oh. At precisely 7 o'clock, Victoria stood outside the Warrington dining room. The corridor smelled faintly of candle wax and polished wood. Rain tapped gently against the tall, stained glass windows. She smoothed her dark blue gown, a modest dress, yet one of far finer quality than a governess ought to possess, a mistake she could not afford again. You are Clara Winters, she reminded herself quietly. A governess from Bath. Nothing more. She opened the door. The room was illuminated by tall silver candelabras. Shadows danced along the paneled walls, and the long dining table had been set for only two. At its head sat Alexander Hargrave. The Duke rose as she entered. The gesture was restrained but unmistakably courteous. Miss Winters. Your Grace. She curtsied, again too gracefully. Alexander noticed. He noticed everything. Victoria took her seat. Dinner began in polite silence. Soup was served first. She reached for the correct spoon automatically. Across the table, the Duke had not yet lifted his. He was watching her, not rudely, but carefully. As though studying a puzzle, she thought. Finally he spoke. Your manners are impeccable. Victoria felt a chill. My mother worked in a noble household, she said evenly. She believed proper conduct was important. Alexander lifted his wine glass. It seems she taught you very well. The silence stretched. Then he changed the subject. The children appear different since your arrival. Victoria allowed herself a small smile. They are remarkable children, Your Grace. They were always remarkable. His tone carried a faint edge. They simply needed someone who noticed. Alexander leaned back slightly. Noticed. Yes. She met his gaze. Children know when they are unseen. The fire crackled softly between them. For a moment neither spoke. Then Victoria added gently, Sophie believes the stars are fireflies trapped behind the sky. Alexander's expression changed, just slightly. Their mother used to say things like that. Victoria lowered her gaze. I'm sorry. There is nothing to apologize for. His voice had grown quieter. She hesitated. Then the question escaped before caution could stop it. And you, Your Grace? He looked up sharply. What about me? When was the last time someone asked how you are? The room seemed to freeze. Alexander's wine glass hovered in midair. I am quite well. Victoria studied him. Are you? He set the glass down harder than necessary. You forget your place, Miss Winters. Color drained from her face. You're right, forgive me. He was silent for several seconds. Then unexpectedly, you're not entirely wrong. She looked up. The Duke's gaze rested on her with a strange intensity. This house, she said softly, feels like it has been holding its breath. And you believe you've changed that? No. She shook her head gently. The children have. He studied her again, the strange governess with perfect posture, the woman who spoke to him without trembling, the woman whose presence had somehow brought laughter back to Warrington Hall. You interest me, Miss Winters. Her pulse stumbled. I only care about the children. I suspect, he said slowly, it is more than that. At that exact moment, the door opened. The butler entered carrying a sealed envelope. My apologies, Your Grace. Urgent correspondence from London. Alexander broke the seal. As he read, the change in him was immediate. His expression hardened. The warmth in the room vanished. Victoria felt dread crawl slowly up her spine. Your Grace? He looked up. The Duke's icy blue eyes locked onto hers. This letter is from Lord Henry Lennox. The name struck her like lightning. He is searching for his missing sister. Alexander slowly slid the paper across the table. Lady Victoria Lennox, age 24. His gaze sharpened. Brown hair, green eyes. The room seemed to tilt. He requests all noble households report new hires who possess... He paused. Manners too refined for their station. Victoria's lungs forgot how to breathe. Alexander rose slowly from his chair. The firelight stretched his shadow across the table. You speak French. You dine like a lady. And you look a duke directly in the eye. His voice lowered, dangerously calm. Tell me, Miss Winters. He stepped closer. Who are you? Victoria felt the fragile mask she had worn for weeks finally shatter. Tears blurred her vision. My name, her voice broke, was Victoria. She lifted her chin with the last strength she possessed. Victoria Lennox. And for the first time since arriving at Warrington Hall, the Duke finally knew exactly who was standing in his house. For a long moment after the confession, neither of them moved. The candles flickered quietly along the dining table. Rain whispered against the tall windows, and Victoria Lennox stood before the most powerful man in Yorkshire, waiting for her fate. Alexander Hargrave did not speak. He simply studied her, not with outrage, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling. Thought. "You lied to me," he said at last. Victoria forced herself not to look away. "Yes." Her honesty seemed to surprise him. "You forged references." "Yes." "You entered my house under a false name." "I did." Silence stretched between them. Then Alexander walked slowly to the fireplace. For several seconds he stood there, staring into the flames. Victoria's hands trembled. At any moment he could summon the servants, send a message to London, hand her over to the brother she had fled. Instead, the Duke asked a single quiet question. "Why?" The word echoed softly through the room. Victoria swallowed. "My brother has debts." Alexander did not turn. "Most men in London do." "Not like Henry." Her voice trembled now. "He gambled away everything our father left us." The Duke's expression darkened slightly. "And?" "He arranged a marriage." Victoria felt the shame burn her throat. "To whom?" "The Earl of Braftoft." Alexander's head slowly turned. The name required no explanation. Braftoft was infamous. 65, 3 dead wives, a fortune built on cruelty. "He intended to sell you," Alexander said flatly. Victoria's silence confirmed it. "And so you ran." "Yes." The fire crackled softly. Alexander studied her again. The proud posture, the quiet courage, the desperation beneath it. "You could have sought protection from other relatives." "I have none." Her voice softened. "My parents are dead." "My brother inherited everything." Alexander understood more than she realized. Aristocratic daughters without guardians were not protected. "They were yes, son. Why Warrington Hall?" he asked. "The advertisement." "For a governess." "Yes." "You believed hiding among my servants would keep you safe?" Victoria hesitated. Then she spoke the truth. "I believed no one would look twice at a governess." Alexander almost smiled, a bitter, fleeting expression. "You misjudged me. I see that now." Silence returned. Victoria gathered the last of her courage. "I will leave tomorrow." Alexander frowned slightly. "You will what?" "I never meant to deceive you for long." Her eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. "But please," her voice broke, "do not punish the children because of me." The Duke stared at her. "You're concerned about them?" "Always." Her hands tightened. "They have already lost too much." The word struck something inside him, something he had buried with Eleanor. He walked slowly back to the table, picked up the letter from Lord Lennox. "Read the description again." Then, without warning, he dropped it into the fire. Victoria gasped. "Your Grace." The paper curled and blackened instantly. The name Victoria Lennox vanished into ash. "No one will report you," Alexander said calmly. She stared at him in disbelief. "I don't understand." "You will not leave." Her breath caught. "What?" "My children need you." His voice remained measured. "They laugh again. They sleep again. They speak of their mother without fear." Victoria blinked rapidly. "And I," he added quietly, "have no intention of destroying that." "You're protecting me?" "I'm protecting them." The distinction mattered, but not as much as he pretended. Victoria's voice trembled. "You trust me?" Alexander considered the question carefully. "No." Her shoulders fell slightly, "but I recognize desperation when I see it." His eyes held hers. "And I recognize courage." Victoria exhaled slowly. "Thank you." He inclined his head. "But understand something clearly, Lady Victoria." Her name sounded different in his voice, stronger. "You will remain Miss Winters in this house. No one else must know. I understand. And one more thing." His gaze sharpened. "No more lies between us." Victoria nodded. "No more lies." Alexander turned away toward the window, because something dangerous had entered his carefully controlled world. Hope. And the Duke of Warrington was not yet certain his heart could survive it. After that night, something invisible changed inside Warrington Hall. Nothing was spoken aloud. No one mentioned the letter. No one spoke the name Victoria Lennox again. Yet the air between the Duke and the governess was no longer the same. Before, Alexander Hargrave had looked at her with distant curiosity. Now he watched her, quietly, constantly. Victoria felt it in every room. The library, the corridors, the long dinner table where silence had once ruled like a monarch. Sometimes she would lift her eyes from a book and find his gaze already resting on her, not cold, Not suspicious, but searching, as though he were trying to understand how a woman who arrived as a lie had somehow become the beating heart of his home. One rainy afternoon, the library windows rattled under the wind sweeping across the Yorkshire moors. Victoria sat on the carpet beside Sophie, helping the little girl spell words from a small reading book. Thomas practiced writing at the desk. The room was warm with firelight. Safe, alive. Then the door opened. Alexander stepped inside. His black coat was damp from the storm. Strands of dark hair clung slightly to his forehead. The children looked up. "Papa!" Sophie abandoned the book and ran to him. Victoria held her breath. For months she had wondered if he would ever allow himself to respond. The Duke of Warrington had not embraced his children since their mother's funeral. Yet now, slowly, Alexander bent down. He knelt, and Sophie threw her small arms around his neck. The room fell perfectly still. His hands hovered awkwardly for a moment. Then they settled around the little girl. Holding her, truly holding her. Victoria felt her throat tighten painfully. So this was why he had let her stay. Not out of charity, not out of curiosity, but because something inside him had begun to wake again. Thomas cleared his throat. "We're reading Shakespeare." Alexander looked toward the desk. "Which play?" "Hamlet." The Duke's brow lifted slightly. "A grim choice for a nursery." Victoria stood slowly. Children understand grief better than adults believe. Alexander's eyes moved to her. "And Hamlet?" "He wasn't mad," she said softly. "He was lost." The room grew quiet, because everyone understood they were no longer speaking about the play. Alexander studied her for a long moment. "You have strong opinions, Miss Winters." "I apologize." "No." His voice softened unexpectedly. "Don't." The word surprised them both. Without warning, Alexander pulled out a chair and sat beside the children. Thomas stared openly. Sophie clapped her hands. "Papa, read!" And for the next hour something remarkable happened. The Duke stayed. He corrected Thomas's pronunciation once with patient calm. Sophie eventually climbed into his lap. He allowed it. His deep voice filled the library as he read Shakespeare aloud. Victoria watched from across the room. Watched the stern Duke become simply a father. Watched grief loosen its grip on the man she had once feared. And somewhere in that quiet hour, her heart betrayed her, because she realized something dangerous. Alexander Hargrave was not cold. He was wounded, and wounds had a terrible way of making people love more fiercely once they healed. When the children finally left with Mrs. Dawson for supper, the library fell silent again. Victoria gathered the books. Alexander stood near the window watching the rain. Then he spoke. "Thank you." She looked up. "For what?" "For this." He gestured toward the empty room. "The laughter. The life." She shook her head gently. "They did that themselves." Alexander turned toward her. The firelight caught in his pale blue eyes. "No," he said quietly. "You did." Her breath caught. Then, for the first time, he said her real name. "Victoria." The sound of it sent a tremor through her chest. "Yes?" He took one step closer, then stopped. Something held him back. Duty. Fear. Memory. "Nothing," he said quietly. "Good night." And he left the library. Victoria stood frozen beside the shelves, her pulse racing, because the way he had said her name carried a promise neither of them were ready to speak aloud, and deep in her chest a dangerous truth had already begun to bloom. She was falling in love with the Duke of Warrington. The next morning the Duke did not appear at breakfast, nor the next, nor the next. For 3 days Alexander Hargrave avoided her. At first Victoria believed it was coincidence. The estate demanded his time. Dukes had obligations, land to inspect, tenants to see, letters from London that required attention. But by the second evening the pattern was unmistakable. Whenever she entered a room, he had just left it. Whenever dinner was served, he sent word he would dine in his study. Even the children noticed. "Papa is busy again," Sophie said one afternoon, her small voice heavy with disappointment. Victoria smiled gently. "Yes, darling." But the truth sat like a stone inside her chest. He was retreating, and she understood why. The night in the library had come dangerously close to something neither of them had expected, something Alexander Hargrave feared more than grief: hope. On the third afternoon, Victoria took the children outside. Spring had finally touched the Yorkshire countryside. The grass still shimmered with morning rain, and the air smelled of wet earth and new leaves. Sophie ran ahead across the lawn. Thomas followed more slowly, trying and failing to appear dignified. Victoria removed her shoes and gathered her skirts, laughing as the children splashed through the damp grass. The sound echoed across the gardens, bright, free. alive. From the tall window of his study, Alexander saw everything. He had been trying to work. Contracts and ledgers lay open on his desk. But the moment he heard Sophie laugh, his attention had shattered. Now he stood motionless at the glass. Victoria lifted Sophie into the air. The little girl shrieked with joy. Thomas ran past them, nearly slipping in the mud. And Victoria? Victoria laughed, not politely, not carefully, but freely. The sight struck Alexander like a blow. For one painful heartbeat, the scene looked exactly like something he had once lost. Eleanor had laughed like that, turned ordinary afternoons into sunlight. His chest tightened. I cannot survive losing this again. He stepped away from the window sharply and pulled the bell rope. The butler appeared moments later. Send word to Miss Winters. Yes, Your Grace. She will no longer attend dinner. The butler hesitated. Alexander's voice hardened. Her responsibilities are the children, nothing more. Of course, Your Grace. The door closed. The silence returned, but it felt heavier now. Alexander sat at his desk again, staring down at the contracts. The words blurred. All he could see was Victoria running barefoot through the garden. Alive, warm, dangerous. Letting her closer would mean risking everything he had already lost. So he rebuilt the walls. Distance, formality, coldness. The only armor he knew how to wear. That night he dined alone. The house felt quiet again. Too quiet. He had just lifted his wine glass when hurried footsteps thundered down the corridor. The study door burst open. Thomas stood there, breathless, terrified. Father! Alexander was on his feet instantly. What is it? Sophie! The boy struggled to breathe. She had a nightmare. She keeps crying for Mama. Alexander felt the air leave his lungs. Mrs. Dawson won't let Miss Winters come. Thomas's small voice cracked. She said you ordered Miss Winters to stay in the nursery. But Sophie keeps calling for her. Alexander didn't wait for another word. He was already running. The nursery door stood open. Inside, Sophie sobbed violently beneath the blankets. Mama! Mama! Mrs. Dawson hovered helplessly beside the bed. And in the doorway stood Victoria, pale, hands clasped tightly together, waiting, obeying his command. Alexander looked from his trembling daughter to the woman who could comfort her, and something inside him finally broke. Go, he said hoarsely. Victoria moved instantly. She knelt beside the bed and gathered Sophie gently into her arms. Soft whispers filled the room, quiet reassurance. Slowly the child's sobs faded. Her small fingers clutched Victoria's dress until sleep finally claimed her again. Alexander stood frozen near the door. Thomas clung silently to his father's hand. And in that fragile moment, the Duke of Warrington realized something terrifying. The greatest danger was not loving someone again. The real danger was continuing to live without it. Victoria did not sleep that night. She remained beside Sophie's bed long after the child's breathing had steadied into the soft rhythm of dreams. The nursery was quiet except for the faint whisper of wind brushing against the windows. Across the room, the candle burned low. Victoria sat in the chair beside the bed, her fingers loosely wrapped around Sophie's small hand. The child had refused to release it, and Victoria had not tried. She knew something had shifted that night, not only in the Duke, but in herself. For weeks, she had told herself she was only a governess, only passing through, only hiding. But when Sophie cried for her instead of her mother, something inside Victoria had answered in a way she could no longer deny. She belonged here, and that realization frightened her more than anything. Morning arrived quietly. Soft gray light filtered through the curtains when Mrs. Dawson appeared in the doorway. Her face looked unusually tense. Miss Winters, she said softly. Yes? The Duke requests your presence in his study. Victoria nodded slowly, but the housekeeper hesitated. There is someone else with him. A cold feeling slipped through Victoria's chest. From London. Her heart stopped. She knew immediately. Henry. The door to the Duke's study stood open. Victoria paused only a moment before entering. Alexander Hargrave stood near the fireplace. His expression was controlled, unreadable. But the man standing across the room was impossible to mistake. Tall, golden-haired, perfectly dressed. Lord Henry Lennox turned the moment she stepped inside. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, his voice dripped with satisfaction. My missing sister. Victoria lifted her chin. I'm not going back. Henry laughed. My dear Victoria, you misunderstand the situation. He began strolling across the room as though he owned it. You have caused quite an inconvenience in London. Do you have any idea how embarrassing it is to explain a runaway sister to society? I imagine honesty would help. His eyes flashed. You forget your position. No, she said calmly. For the first time in my life, I remember it clearly. Henry turned toward Alexander. I appreciate your hospitality, Your Grace, truly. But now that I've found her, I'll take her home. No. The single word cut through the room like steel. Henry frowned. Alexander stepped forward. His voice remained calm, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Lady Victoria is under my protection. Henry scoffed. She is my sister, and a grown woman. Alexander's gaze never wavered. She has the right to decide where she stays. Henry's smile vanished. You cannot interfere in family matters, Your Grace. I can, Alexander replied quietly, when they occur in my house. The room grew very still. Henry turned sharply toward Victoria. You will come with me. No. Her voice was steady now. I will not marry Braftoft. You have no choice. She does. Alexander stepped beside her, close enough that Victoria felt the warmth of him. The quiet strength, the protection he had promised. Henry's expression darkened. This is absurd. Alexander's voice dropped lower. You have overstayed your welcome, Lord Lennox. Leave. For several seconds, Henry did not move. Then he laughed bitterly. You will regret this, Victoria. She met his gaze calmly. No. For the first time, I am exactly where I wish to be. Henry glared at them both. Then he stormed from the study, slamming the door so hard the sound echoed through the hall. Silence followed. Victoria's knees nearly gave way. Alexander caught her instantly. His hands were steady, gentle. It's over, he said quietly. He's gone. She looked up at him. Tears blurred her vision. Why, she whispered. Why would you risk this for me? Alexander brushed a strand of hair from her face. Because the truth could no longer be hidden. Because you matter. His voice softened. To the children. To this house. Then, after a breath, to me. Victoria's heart trembled. He looked at her the way a man looks when he finally stops pretending. You brought life back into this home. You taught my children to laugh again. And you reminded me how to live. He hesitated. Something vulnerable flickered beneath the Duke's composure. So the choice is yours. His voice lowered. You may stay here as Miss Winters. Or you may stay as something far more important. Victoria searched his face. The proud, guarded man who had slowly allowed his heart to wake again. I will stay, she whispered. His hand tightened gently around hers. Good. From somewhere down the corridor, Sophie's voice echoed sleepily. Mama? Victoria froze. Alexander smiled faintly. Well, he said softly, it seems the children have already decided. And for the first time since arriving at Warrington Hall, Victoria Lennox understood something with perfect certainty. She was no longer hiding. She was home,